So let us know as well where you heard about the webinar. That would be great to find out where you got the link from. That would be awesome for us to see. So let me introduce Pictas to you before I hand over to Robert, who's the reason why you're all here today. So we are a multicultural community of photographers, artists, and creatives. And our vision is to create a community that connects everybody and that we're inspired by each other, and also that we learn together. So learning together is really important for us. And that's the reason why we've started Pictas Academy, which is where we're going to be hosting the trainings, and where we're collaborating with tutors and where we're sharing knowledge and helping everybody to grow and learning within the community. So if you're new to Pictas, we are very active online and we have around 500,000 followers online, and we are on Instagram, and we've got, I think, maybe somebody can correct me with this, I think we have 11 hubs on Vero as well. There are over 100 members in our community, which is growing, which is fabulous. And each month we have about 120,000 views on the website, which is pretty impressive. We host a monthly magazine, we host a monthly photographic competition on there, and we also host we also have our online magazine on the website as well. So you'll find the magazine on there at the moment, the first 2 editions, and I believe they're free now for everybody to look at, because we're about to launch our 3rd magazine at the end of this month. So now's a really good time to go and look at the magazine, because normally it's for donations or part of a membership, but you can see the first 2 editions for free right now. I'm sure we've got your email addresses, but if not, you could also put them into the website where the magazine is as well, and we will inform you of the next editions that are coming out or any training that we're doing as well. We actually came together because we want to make a difference. So we want to share our passion and excitement for creativity, and we want to learn together. So if you hop on over to the website, we've got 2 levels of membership. We've got silver membership, where you'll learn about training and you can be hosted on the social media hubs. And if you go to the gold membership, so you get regular features on the social media hubs. If you go over to the gold membership, you also get access to the magazine as well. And you also get a page on our website. So you have your own page on our website where you can promote your photography and your website, etc. So if you think that that's something that you'd like to be involved in, we would love to welcome you into the community. So if you have any questions with regard to joining Pictas, chat to Matteo. Maybe Matteo, you could put your email address into the chat box so people can talk to you if they need to. And maybe you want to host a webinar or collaborate with us with training. In that case, if you put maybe Waddy, you can put your email address down so people could chat to you as well. So if you've got any other questions, please put them into the chat box and one of us will answer them while the webinar is going on. And with that, I'm going to hand you over to Robert Turiflu. I hope I've said that right, Robert, with 101 Landscape Photography. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Nikki. And welcome everybody to the Landscape 101 photography webinar today. And I'm very honored that Pictas chose me for this webinar this month. Now, I'm gonna start sharing my screen and you should see it in full screen in just a second. And I'm gonna hit the play button. And like I said, if you have any questions, like we said, use the Q&A function and type it in there, and I will go on that at the end of the webinar and look at some of the questions that you have that probably weren't answered. And going to the next slide here, and many of you have started doing that, and we always want to know where you're from today. And I see a lot of familiar names in the attendee list, and I know many of you are from New Jersey, and I know you personally. But if you haven't typed anything in yet, let us know where you're joining us from today. maybe tell us the city and state and country where you're joining us from. And then, maybe you also tell us like how do you feel about yourself? Are you a beginner or intermediate or maybe even advanced photographer at this point? I don't sell anything, but I do have a website where I just share some of my images for friends and family. And about myself, I'm self-taught. I always enjoyed the American West, the landscapes that we have in America. And I came from Germany when I was 20 years old, which was a long time ago. And I just still enjoy shooting landscapes very much whenever I have an opportunity. I don't have that much of an opportunity out here in New Jersey necessarily, but New York is nearby, so sometimes I shoot the cityscapes up there. But please head over to my website for some more landscape and wildlife images if you just want to see what I do in New Jersey and when I travel to some of the places in the world that we have. And I hope that with the pandemic behind us, that we can start traveling a little bit more soon. And hopefully you'll take something away from the webinar today that will help you in your landscape photography journey. So what are we talking about today? We will cover equipment, right? This is a 101 talk, and 101 refers to like our American system of university courses, where the 101 course is the entry-level course, where you just get a lot of information thrown at you. You learn a lot of the basics and nothing too much in depth. So I'm going to cover a lot of information today. And if you want to learn more about something, let's say, for example, how to photograph in HDR mode, or if you want to, if you need a new tripod and you want to buy one, maybe you want to do more research. But I'm going to cover a lot of the basics today. So we'll talk about the equipment, like why are tripods important and what filters do I use and why do I use them and so forth. We'll talk about some of the techniques to get good landscape photos. And for example, we'll talk about how to get really sharp images from the foreground all the way into the background, like what settings do we use to do that? We'll talk about something called exposed to the right and why that is important. And maybe you heard those terms before. Maybe somebody said, hey, exposed to the right, and you're not really sure what it means, right? So we'll talk about that too. A few composition basics. And I feel with composition, there's so many ways you can compose a landscape. If you do a Google search and you type in landscape composition techniques or something like that, there will be advice from so many different websites, and we'll just cover very few today, like 4 of them. I show you an example of post-processing where I'll show you a raw image right from the camera and how I did just a little bit of processing to make it a much stronger image, to make it more impactful. And then at the end, we'll talk about scouting, which to me is one of the most fun parts of landscape photography, because you can research an area you want to go to, you can plan, and you can really look forward to traveling there and photographing what you imagined ahead of time. What I do for whenever I show you an image today that I took, what I'll do for the image is I give you the location where I took it, and I'll give you the EXIF data, meaning that information that I had set on my camera, all the settings that I had to capture that shot. So for example, this shot of the lake in the Canadian Rocky Mountains, Lake Agnes, I had my camera on a tripod, and my settings were 1/8 of a second at f/18 at ISO 100 at 20 millimeter, meaning a wide angle lens. So every image that I'll share with you, I'll give you that information. And throughout the webinar today, you will notice that, hey, Robert always seems to shoot at a very low ISO setting, right? Or Robert always seems to shoot at f/18 or f/22 or f/16 or most of the time. And that's because we want landscape shots that are sharp from foreground to background. And I'll explain those settings as we go through the webinar today. Okay, let's talk about equipment. Let's talk about camera, cameras and lenses that we use for landscape photography. And to be quite honest, for landscape photography, you can use a wide variety of cameras. You can take great photos with your smartphone. If you have an old point and shoot camera, you take great photos of a landscape with that, right? Nowadays, we have mirrorless cameras, which get more and more advanced. But if you think back, and everybody knows Ansel Adams. Ansel Adams didn't have a smartphone. He didn't have a digital camera. His equipment was very rudimentary compared to what we have nowadays. And he took great images, black and white landscapes back then. So the technology is not that important for finding good light and a good composition and an amazing landscape to capture that. So rest assured, whatever camera you have at home, they can capture really great landscape photos. And we don't need the most up-to-date camera that some people buy for landscape photography. We don't need, like I have a Canon R5, which does amazing work with tracking birds in flight. Like it can capture a bird's eyeball and it will stay on that and capture it during the flight. It's like autofocus tracking is amazing. But we don't need any of that stuff for our landscape photography. So basic cameras will do. Know, though, that the recent trend that started going into mirrorless cameras, which is a new generation of cameras that does not have a mirror inside the camera body anymore, that would flip up and take the picture and then flip down again. Mirrorless cameras will be the future, and the manufacturers like Canon and Nikon and Olympus and Sony, they will stop producing digital single lens reflex cameras in the future, right? And everything will go mirrorless. So if you are thinking of buying a new camera now, or if you don't have a high-end camera and you want to get one instead of the entry-level camera you have, look into mirrorless cameras because they will not go away, and DSLRs will. And always the question to ask when you buy equipment, it is an expensive hobby, right? When you buy equipment, the question you need to ask yourself is like, okay, what is my budget? How much money do I want to spend on a camera versus on a trip, versus on a new lens, versus on a tripod or new camera bag? It gets really expensive, and many of you know that quite well. Let's talk about, let me just move something out of the screen here. So I cannot see the top of my slide. Excuse me. Oops, let me go back. Sorry. Let's talk about the cameras. Every time a new camera comes out, they will tell you something in those specs about something called the dynamic range. And as technology progresses and as they come out with new image sensors in those cameras, the dynamic range, which is a measure basically, okay, how well can my camera capture the darkest darks in the shadows and the brightest brights in the sky, basically, like how well does my camera do capturing the darks and the bright areas. And every new generation of camera sensor will have a better dynamic range. It will not be as good as our eyeballs. Like when we go out into a cave and we come out of a cave and we look into the sky, our eyes adjust so quickly, we don't even notice, often like that we have this difference between the dark areas and the bright areas. But cameras are kind of limited that way. But no, dynamic range is improving over the years. It's getting better. And oftentimes price is related to that. So the better the dynamic range, the better the camera can capture those darkest darks and the brightest brights, the more expensive the camera may be. Are megapixels important? It depends. It really does. It depends on what you want to do with your image. Do you want to print it? Do you want a high quality image that you can then maybe display on a screen, that you want to have a big print made out of and hang it on your wall, or give it to somebody as a present to hang in a big exhibition place? You have to look at that. And I'll explain it to you on an example in a couple slides from now. And then there's different sensor types. Sometimes a camera will be advertised saying this is a crop sensor camera, or it will be a full sensor camera. know about the sensor type that full sensors are bigger sensors in your camera. And generally speaking, they can capture a better quality image than a crop sensor camera. Many times the crop sensor cameras, especially in DSLR cameras, are entry-level cameras because that image sensor is smaller and it's cheaper for the manufacturer to put in there. That the whole thing with full and crop sensors, that may all change with mirrorless cameras. They may, most of them may be full sensor cameras in the future. And then build quality is something else when you buy a camera that is affected by the price, basically. Higher priced cameras will have a better build quality, meaning you can take one of the, a Canon R5 or a Nikon Z9, the latest cameras, you can take them out into a snowstorm, into a rainstorm, and they're weather sealed. You don't have to worry about them breaking down afterwards. Meanwhile, if you take a cheaper camera out, the water could get into the buttons and into the display and to the viewfinder, and you could have issues with that. So build quality is something that is much, much better with more expensive cameras. So what I want to show you is an image here of a raw file, meaning this is an image that I captured a lot long ago, and it came straight out of my camera. It's not edited, it's not touched up, nothing happened to it. It's a 30-second exposure. That's why there's no waves in the water. The water looks very smooth. And it is a one frame that I took. I wanted to take a high dynamic range image called HDR, and we'll talk about it in like 20 minutes from now in more detail. So it was just one frame, 30 seconds. And I want to show you that, with my camera, high megapixel camera, let's look at some detail in the image. So let's look at this little circled area. And on the next slide, you can see that with my Canon 45 megapixel, far away in Manhattan on the other side of that river, I can still see pretty good detail in one of those high rises, right? So with a high megapixel camera, good bit depth in terms of like it captures color quite well. Now, I took a similar shot with my iPhone X, and when I cropped the iPhone X, my free camera that came with my phone plan, you can see the quality difference between the two images. Now, do high megapixels matter? If I wanted to print this image and hang it on the wall somewhere, it may matter, right? Because if I blow up this image and make it big enough, then I can see detail in the image I captured with the good camera that I have that cost me $4,000. And I don't see much detail in my free iPhone X camera anymore. So do megapixels matter? Does camera quality matter? Yes, it does, if you want to blow it up. If you just want to take pictures for social media, right, and share it with your friends on Instagram, then you probably don't have to go to those lengths where you have a high megapixel, very expensive camera. So for example, with that image on the left side, I could blow that up 40 by 60 inches and don't even do anything with it because it's such a high megapixel image. And that picture was taken in Jersey City not long ago. And I told you it was what I took was a HDR image, and it was one frame. So I combined 3 images to create then the final product here, which is more colorful, has more impact than that one raw file I showed you. So in post-processing, there's a lot we can do afterwards when we get back home after our photo shoot and put those images on our computer. Okay, so that was my camera talk. Let's talk about lenses. The good news for landscape photographers is that landscape lenses in general are a lot cheaper than wildlife lenses. We can spend a few $1,000s on landscape lenses and get really good ones and be happy with them, go out and shoot, and they will, cover like 99% of what we ever want to photograph in the landscape world. One landscape lens, a really good one, may cost you $2,000 in that neighborhood. If you wanted to do wildlife and get a really good wildlife lens, many of them cost $10,000. Some of them cost up to $20,000. So landscape photography is, generally speaking, a bit cheaper than wildlife. And all manufacturers have something called the lens trinity, sometimes called the holy lens trinity, where they produce 3 zoom lenses from very wide angle to more of a telephoto type of lens, where they can cover a wide range of focal length. So for example, Canon and Nikon and Sony, they will all have a wide angle lens somewhere between 15 and 35 millimeters, which can capture scenes that are, have a much wider view than what we can see as a person. Like our view is not 15 millimeters, it's not really wide angle, like 15 millimeter, 16 millimeter, 20 millimeters will capture a landscape that we cannot see with our eyes unless we move our head left to right. And then oftentimes there's a lens around 24 to 70 millimeters, and then 70 to 200 millimeters. Now, the 3 lenses that I have on the slide for you, they are f2.8 lenses, meaning f2.8 is the f-stop of a lens, and the lower the number, 2.8, sometimes there's an f1.4 lens, 1.8 lens, but 2.8 means it lets a lot of light through the lens, hitting the camera and the sensor. And the more light a lens lets in to go into your camera, the more expensive they usually get. And so these are landscape lenses that let in a lot of light, which can be used for things like astrophotography, to shoot the Milky Way, to shoot the night sky. But know that all manufacturers also make lenses that are smaller. They don't let as much light in, and they maybe have a f-stop of f4. And they are a lot cheaper. So one of these lenses that you see up there, you can probably pick up for around $2,000 each. If you get an f4 lens, maybe they will cost you $500 or $600 each. And then there's just a limitation that, again, it comes to build quality. The cheaper lenses may not be weather sealed, and you may not be able to do fun things like shooting the Milky Way at nighttime. You need a more expensive lens for that. Well, here's an example of a place where I used a wide-angle lens to capture the whole entire scene. There's a beautiful lake up in the Canadian Rockies at the beginning of the Icefields Parkway, almost between Banff and Jasper. And I needed to choose a 16 millimeter wide-angle lens to capture the entire lake. And when you come to that viewpoint as a person and you look out over the lake, it's impossible to capture that whole scene without moving your head left and right, because again, wide-angle lenses can capture more than we can take in. Here's another example from Iceland last November, where I wanted to capture all these photographers that showed up, and they were photographing the church, and I photographed the photographers photographing the church. So it expands the landscape, it expands your view, and it makes things in the, like objects, appear a little bit smaller than they appear in real life. Like this church, if I were to stand there, I look at the church, it would appear to me, to my view, bigger than what this final image is here. Because again, it's a much wider scene that we can capture with 16 millimeters. Now, if you want to get closer to the action, closer to something you want to shoot, this was captured at 30 millimeters, which is much closer to what we see in real life. Like I can imagine standing there, and this is probably what I would see. I would see those 2 people in the background. I would see the geyser, and that's more like real life to me. And then sometimes we need to get closer to what we want to photograph. So this was again up in the Canadian Rocky Mountains, and it's called the Crowfoot Glacier. And you drive up the Icefields Parkway, and there's all these beautiful sites of glaciers left and right, on that road. And you just pull over with your car, and you have a longer lens here, 70 millimeters. You can get closer to the subject that you want to photograph. And then sometimes you maybe need to get even closer. And you may say, Robert, you just told us about landscapes, and now you're showing us a picture of horses. What's going on? This is not wildlife. But in this case, I feel like that these were the horses that we found in that landscape. So to me, this could be, it's like a landscape photo to me. And when you look at that EXIF data that I have below the image, where I say Icelandic horses, all of a sudden you see f2.8 in there. And you're like, Robert, you told us to shoot at f18 or f22 for landscapes to get everything in focus. Now, in this case, I decided to shoot f2.8 just to get the horses in focus and not the foreground and not the background, to get this beautiful shallow depth of field with just very limited space is in focus, in this case, the horses. Okay, moving on. I told you I have a lot to talk about. Moving on to the tripods today. Now, as I explained, like, tripods are really important because we want to have a sharp image and they shouldn't be moving around. They shouldn't be wobbly. They need to be solid. And there's still two types of tripods on the market now. Ones that are made out of aluminum, or as we say in Europe, aluminium. And there's more expensive ones that are made out of carbon fiber. Now, the carbon fiber ones are usually lighter. So when you carry your equipment, carbon fiber will be a pleasure to carry compared to aluminum, because you lose some weight there, like a couple pound difference maybe. And the good news is that they're getting a lot cheaper. More and more manufacturers decided to only make carbon fiber tripods now. They don't even make aluminum anymore. And they do come down in price quite a bit. Now, if you're in the market for a new tripod, if you say after this webinar, hey, Robert said I need a really good tripod. If you go to your better half at home and say, hey, Robert said I need to buy a good tripod, and my tripod is old and wobbly, you can maybe go to B&H Photo, which is this giant store that we have in New York City. You go online, you can type in tripods, and there will just be over 1,000 entries for all kinds of tripods that maybe start at $15 or $20, and you can go up to $1,500, right? And you may still not know what to buy. So what I would recommend is that, if you have a friend who is a photographer and they have a different tripod, or they have a tripod that they love, ask them about their tripod. See if you can see it in action. See if you can pick it up. Ask them what they like about it. Ask them what they don't like about it. And then again, I always say, what is my budget? How much am I willing to spend on a tripod? Am I willing to spend $400, $200, $50, $1,500? And if you go to Google and you type in tripod reviews, you may find tripod reviews where the content is sponsored by tripod manufacturers. So you don't really, you may get a one-sided review. I found a website called thecentercolumn.com where they do independent testing of tripods. And I took a little screenshot of their travel tripods where they look at, they add how heavy are they and how big are they when you pack it down. And if you look at that bottom image that just came onto your slide, if you look at the left column there, next to the tripod name, it says price on it. And these were the 4 highest rated tripods that I have listed on that website for travel tripods. And RRS stands for really right stuff. So really right stuff is the best one that I tested, and it's the 3rd best one that I tested. And the 2nd best one that I tested is a Gitzo tripod. But then you look at the price and you're like, oh man, $800, $600, $900. These really good travel tripods are really, really expensive. I don't want to spend this much money. But then you come up to number 4, which is the Leo Photo tripod, and it only costs $200. And the one thing I want to say about Leo Photo tripods, they look really, really, really similar to really right stuff tripods, almost like they were copied. And Leo Photo is manufactured in China. Really right stuff is manufactured in Utah. And there's a big price difference there, but they're really highly rated. So if you want a good tripod, you don't want to spend the money, you don't mind buying a tripod that certainly has some copyright infringement, likely, yeah, you can go with a manufacturer like that and get good equipment for a much lower cost. Similar to the tripod legs that we just talked about with aluminum and carbon fiber, then we have to decide, okay, what kind of tripod head would we like to put on top of those tripod legs to have a good solid foundation. And again, similar to the legs, there's a lot of difference between the type and the quality and the cost. And the only thing I would tell you again is, like, see what your friends are using, ask them why they like it, and ask them what they don't like about it. But if you want some basic advice on a tripod head, use one that is easy to use. Use one that has like good knobs and levers that are easy to turn. Keep in mind that maybe you want to sometimes shoot out in the cold, like do a winter landscape, your hands are getting cold and you need to use that with gloves on, and you want it to be easy to use. And maybe pick one that has a friction control on it, meaning that when you loosen this ball head, what can happen is your camera just like the whole camera head like falls over when the ball head gets loose. With a friction control, it's not really loose. It's just a little, it's easier to use, but it won't fall over so easy. So keep that in mind when you look for ball heads. The last part, in terms of equipment, before we go into the next part, techniques, is bags, filters, and accessories. And if you ever looked into the bag market and you're like, okay, I want to buy a new bag, a crowdfunded bag that I saw on Kickstarter, where they tell me that like this is the greatest camera bag ever that I need to get. Before you do that, ask yourself, what do you want to get out of your bag? Are you a landscape photographer that goes into the backcountry and goes hiking for like 3 days in a row and brings a tent and like lives out in the wilderness to get the shots that they want? Are you, like me, a landscape photographer that just has a hotel room and they go out for the day in the morning and maybe in the evening, and they go back to the hotel room where they have the computer and their cup of coffee in the morning and a hot shower? Or are you the type of photographer that doesn't do much hiking, but they do road trips and they like to see the national parks and they go to all the popular sites where you don't have to go far? You want to take pictures there, and then see what bag will fit those conditions. One thing that I'm always worried about is airplane travel, because airplanes sometimes have different restrictions depending on the airline and if depending on what country the flight is in. And I always want to make sure that I can take my bag with my equipment onto the airplane. I do not want to check $8,000 worth of equipment if I have my computer in there as well, and give it to the airline and say, yeah, sure, put it into the belly of the plane. Just to show you, this is my current bag. I used it in Iceland in November. I was able to fit my camera, my 3 lenses, my computer, filters, accessories, and my tripod on the outside. And I was happy carrying that. And it was a comfortable backpack that I can carry for a little bit of hiking as well. I got 2 slides on filters. And filters, like with the digital camera world and with post-processing, with all the stuff that we're doing right now, there's a lot that we can do. For example, like make the sky darker, make the sky bluer, and things like that, right? That we don't necessarily need filters anymore for. But there's instances where we kind of want to use a filter because we cannot do certain things in Lightroom in post-processing. So the filters that I have that I use a protective filter on the front of my camera lens. And people are split on that. And I'll tell you why. So I tell you why I use one. I have a protective filter on my lens because I did drop lenses in the past onto the ground. And the filter broke but the camera lens was perfectly fine. So I used it for that reason. Some people may tell you, don't put a filter, don't put any glass in front of your lens, any additional glass, because your image will not be as sharp. And I never had that problem. I never seen that happening to me. So if somebody tells you that, ask them to give you an example, because I don't necessarily believe it that much. And there's sharpening software. You can sharpen an image afterwards a little bit more if it needs to be sharpened. I use a polarizing filter. And polarizing filters in the old days, before we had digital, were oftentimes used to make the sky a little bluer. When we had film, right, film photography, and we didn't have Lightroom and Photoshop, we sometimes put this filter on there, and we had to position ourselves in the right angle to the sun, and then we can make the sky a darker blue to make it, look prettier than it was sometimes. And you can see that in that image on the left side where the person is holding up that filter, and you can see how the sky gets darker. But what I use it for most of the time is to reduce reflections. And you can imagine that many times when you photograph a scene with a creek or waterfall, that you can get reflections when there's water on, let's say, wet rocks and the sun is shining. Or if you want to shoot through a piece of glass, maybe you're in New York City on one of the observation platforms on the World Trade Center or Empire State Building, and you have plexiglass in front of you and there's a reflection. You can use a polarizing filter to cut down on that glare to get a better shot of the city, right? So I use that. The last filter I have in my bag, it's called a neutral density filter, and they come either as being completely solid or they are graduated. And what does that do, you may ask? So a solid neutral density filter is just a very, very dark piece of glass that you put in front of the lens. And all of a sudden we have less light available. And to compensate for that, we will have to extend our exposure time. So sometimes I use neutral density filters to get like, a minute long exposure or 2 minutes or 5 minutes to get maybe clouds in the sky and make them all streaky, or to have like waves and make them all smooth over time. So it will extend your exposure time. A graduated neutral density filter is half dark and half light, half dark and half nothing, basically. It's just glass that's clear in the top half, maybe really dark. And then there's graduation in between. And you can use those filters when you have really big differences between light and dark. So imagine that you're on a beach and the sky is really bright, and maybe it's a black sand beach in Hawaii, and the sand is really dark, right? And if you try to capture that with the limits of the high dynamic range of our camera, where it has a hard time capturing the brightest brights and the darkest darks, you can put this graduated filter in there to make that sky a little bit darker. And that may help you to capture a better image. Now, one word on pricing. As you know, camera equipment is expensive, and these filters can get very expensive. I can buy a circular, polarizing filter for $200, or I can buy one for $30. And many times, the more expensive filters are more expensive because they have a better process in how they coat those filters, which then will lead to better color rendition. Meaning, for example, you photograph a sunset with a neutral density filter. You come home, you put it in Lightroom, and everything has like this purple hue on it. And you have to work really hard in Lightroom to make this picture look normal again, like a good sunset. With good filters, that doesn't happen so much. The color rendition on the good filters, on the $200 filters, let's put it this way, is much better than the cheaper filter. So something to keep in mind. And here's an example again that I want to show you. A little creek in New Jersey in the fall. And when I got there, I wanted to achieve two things. I wanted to make the water blurry, right? So I needed a longer shutter speed. So I took many pictures that day with like, 5-second exposure, 3-second exposure, half a second exposure. This one was 1.6-second exposure. And I picked that one because I liked the way the water flowed the best. The other thing I wanted to accomplish was to get rid of reflections. And you can see there's a lot of water in the image, and you can see some stones that are a little shiny. And without the polarizer on that, those stones would be really shiny. There was a little bit of water on it, and it would be way more reflective than what you see in here now. So the polarizer cut down on the glare. And it made me actually look, if you look on the bottom of the image, you can look down to the ground, to the stones in the water. It actually cut back that glare quite a bit too, to make, make the water clearer in that image as well. Okay, 3 more items. You need to have a remote control. Many cameras have like these infrared remote controls. Many cameras have an app for your phone nowadays you can use as a remote control, but I would highly recommend like a cheap remote control with a wire on it. Because imagine you're out in the middle of nowhere, and for some reason your app doesn't connect because of connectivity issues, or your phone runs out of battery, and then you cannot use that app that you relied on for your remote camera. These cable releases, they're cheap. You have a socket on your camera, and yeah, it's super easy just to take a photo without ever touching the camera to avoid any camera shake and to ensure that you get the sharpest possible image. You may have seen the next one before. It's a rocket blower. And you can, like if it rains, it's super easy to just pump that thing to get a little bit of air out from the nozzle and clean off water droplets on your camera. Or to get sand out of your equipment. If you've ever been down in Arizona, Antelope Canyon, or any other slot canyons where they have sandstone, you may notice that after being there for an hour, there's a lot of fine sand all over your equipment. And I had to work with this little blower here quite a bit to get all the sand off and all the little crevices where it got into. So it's a useful tool to have. And then these lens wipes, I usually buy like a big box of 500 or 600 on Amazon. The Zeiss lens wipes, and they're single use. They have some kind of cleaning liquid on there, and I use those things all the time. When I photograph out in the rain or when it's drizzling, I use those all the time to clean off my equipment, my lens. Okay, done with the equipment. Using light. So you have used lights of like sunset and sunrises. So you've heard the term golden hour. I hope that all of you heard the term golden hour, which is about an hour, depending on the time of the year and the latitude and where you're at. It's about an hour after sunrise and before sunset, where the sun is low on the horizon and it gives you this beautiful sideways light. Right, so this is a picture from Iceland I took a few years ago, and there was just this beautiful sunrise that went on for a long time, because in the fall, in November, the sun is low on the horizon for a longer time over there. This was another image of the sunrise coming up using light. When the sun comes up over the horizon, you can try to capture a sunburst to get that in there into your image if you like to use that as part of your composition. But sometimes you may find that, hey, I'm here for sunrise, but the sun is not rising because it's all covered with clouds in the sky, right? But using light on this occasion may work in your favor as well, because when the sun is not up and you don't have the side light, when there's a cloud cover, you have more even light. And you don't have to worry about these really bright or really dark areas that much. And when you have clouds in the sky, maybe there's some color, maybe there's a little bit of blue, maybe there's a little bit of orange that comes through. And you can work in post-processing maybe to make those clouds a little bit more dramatic and work with that to get a nice landscape image of a place that you visited that morning. And then when we talk about planning a little later on, I'll show you some apps, but This image, for example, was taken in Yosemite National Park in October. And I knew that in October, the sunset light would hit the valley in such a way that it highlights El Capitan. And so I was there at the right time. And I handheld this shot. I didn't bring my tripod with me. It was at the end of a long day full of hiking. And I'm like, I bring my camera, but that's all I bring. I bring one lens on it. I don't carry my whole backpack. And it's a fairly short hike to Taft Point. But it was beautiful to be there at that moment. Okay, helpful apps. I told you I have some apps for you to help you with planning. Now, this app is super, super simple. It's a very simple app. I still like it a lot. If you type in Sol, S-O-L, into the App Store, you may not find it. You have to search for it a little bit. It's an older app. But I use it for when I travel. And all it does, it like gives me the different times of the day when the sun is at a different position, in terms of golden hour, or when it's above me, or when it's sunrise, when it's sunset, in a very simple way. And I like using it when I travel because I may be jet lagged and I wake up. Half the time I don't know exactly what time it is on the first day or the second day, and I can just open that app and it tells me, okay, there's 2 hours till sunset, and then I know I have to get moving to go where I want to be. If you want to get a bit more complex, right, there is planning tools out there like PhotoPills, which is probably one of the most popular planning apps that will tell you about the position of the sun, the position of the moon, the position of the Milky Way. And it gets really complicated. You can plan these shots, and I'll show you one on the next slide, where you can predict where is the moon going to be when it sets, where is the Milky Way going to be. And then you can plan and say, I'm in a national park. I want the Milky Way to stretch over the horizon exactly in this spot. When do I have to be there for that? There's a lot of tutorials available for PhotoPills, and I recently found a series of tutorials that are really good for PhotoPills. I can tell you what they are if you ask me later. And then there's 2 other similar apps out there called Planet Pro and the Photographer's Ephemeris, which do similar things in many ways. And all of these apps, there's some pros and cons. People will tell you they like this one better than the other one for some reasons, but they all are very good in predicting the sun and the moon, and you can plan where you want to be to get what type of light, as long as the weather, is good. And so, for example, this was one that was planned with PhotoPills initially, and then I had it verified by somebody else who used Planet, just to make sure I'm in the right spot. And I took 3 different images that I then combined in Photoshop to get the transit of the moon, which was 4 minutes long from left to right. Okay, how to get sharp images? That's really important for landscape photographer. I mentioned it a few times already. And here's a list on how to get sharp images. I think these were seven points that I wanted for you to wanted to make sure they come across, because they're all important in the process. So again, use a tripod and make sure it's on solid footing, it's on solid ground. Francisco, who's on the call here with me, we went to Iceland in November, and we shot on the beach at 40-mile-an-hour winds. And we became big fans of spikes that we can add to our tripod legs. There's like 4 or 5 inch spikes that we screwed onto the ends of our tripod to really put them into the beach, into the sand, so the tripod would be stable. Important, stable tripod. Important, turn off the image stabilization on your lens. Many lens camera combinations, if you have image stabilization on when your camera is on a tripod, the camera will do funny things, and they will try to stabilize an already stable image. And that may lead to like the camera focus shifting inside the camera, and you come up with images sometimes that are not sharp at all. So make sure you turn off image stabilization once your camera is on the tripod. On a DSLR camera, I told you DSLR cameras have a mirror inside that moves when you take an image. if you switch that camera to live view when you take that image, you don't have that mirror going up and down, which can cause some kind of camera shake too and make your image not as sharp as it could be. Then use that small f-stop, that f16, 18. Usually f11 and above is really good, but f22 would be good to shoot from, get everything sharp, foreground to background. Set your camera to a low ISO, and the ISO is a measure of how sensitive your camera is to light. And with a low ISO, we kind of need a lot of light to hit our sensor, right? That's why we use a tripod. We don't care about the exposure time. It could be a few seconds long, the camera is stable. With a high ISO, the signal is being amplified inside the camera, and a lot of noise is being introduced. So you may have noticed that if you take a picture with like an ISO of 25,600 at nighttime or after dark, after the sun goes down, you get a lot of this graininess in the image that we want to avoid. I already mentioned to use a remote control and use that live view afterwards and maybe check the image and zoom in to make sure that whatever you wanted sharp in the image is sharp in the image. And here's a picture to explain you really quickly these different items that lead to an exposure. We have the ISO setting. I told you just now about the ISO setting a little bit. And on the right side, if you go to the bottom right, where it says ISO and it says less light, 100, that's the setting we want for landscape photography. It gives us the best, crisp, sharp, clean image. ISO 100. ISO 200 is good, ISO 400 is good, ISO 50 is good. If you go much higher than that, you get noise and the image doesn't look as good. If you go to the left side, I told you, shoot at f18, f20, f22. If we do that, then again, we get less light to our camera sensor. But the image will be better. Everything will be sharp from foreground to background. Now, what does that leave us? Like we have less image coming to our camera because we have an f22. We have less light coming in or being used because we have ISO 100. We need more light, basically. So the only thing we can compensate then is, again, tripod and longer exposures. So many of the landscape pictures that you see out there on Instagram or Facebook or Pictas, they're oftentimes a few seconds long. What to focus on? So there's different rules out there saying, how do I focus in a landscape setting? Right? Some people say, keep it simple, look at the scene in front of you, pick a focal point that's maybe about a third of the way into your scene and focus on that. And most of the time, it will work out just fine. There's something out there called the hyperfocal distance. And that's really useful when you have something that is really, really, really close to you, right? You want something that is like just 5 feet in front of you to be sharp and something that is like 5 miles away to be sharp. Then people will recommend, calculate the hyperfocal distance. And then you have to enter the f-stop, your camera type, your lens, and all this information, and then a calculator, and there's apps out there for that, will tell you exactly where to focus to get that. But no matter which way you use, right, always make sure that your main subject is really crisp and in focus. So for example, this was a scene of the Golden Gate Bridge. And I wanted to make sure that the building, the fort, is sharp, that all the bricks are sharp, that the first tower is sharp, and that even through the fog I can see on my computer, I can zoom in and I want to make sure the second tower is sharp as well. So what I did, I had my settings here. F22 is really important to me. ISO 50 to get the best quality. And I would focus onto the fort because I know from experience that the rest from there on backwards will be in focus and even in the front. The next thing to look for that you may have heard is something called exposed to the right. And what I mean with that, exposing to the right, when you look at your camera, the back of the camera, and you look at your scene, You may be able to get this histogram onto the back of your camera. If you have a better camera, that histogram can be displayed. If not, the histogram will be displayed in your Lightroom or in your post-processing, whatever software you use, you can bring that up. And what I want to say about this histogram, and please, if you don't know the histogram and what it does, afterwards go into Google and find an article or video explaining to you in detail what it does. But briefly, the histogram on the back of the camera will show you the areas of your scene that are dark, over here on the left side mostly, right? And then midtones in the middle, and the areas that are bright in your scene. So the dark area, for example, was the rock up there, and the bright area was the white parts of that sky. Now, exposing to the right means I can adjust my exposure to get this shape, this curve, as far to the right side of my histogram as I can without touching that right side. Because what happens when I touch the right side of the histogram and all these curves in here and all these colors that you see, when it touches the right side, that means whatever is there is pure white. And when we have something in the image that is pure white, there's no detail anymore. It's all gone. It's just pure white. There's no texture, nothing in there that we can recover. So when I set up for the scene, I shot it at f20 and at 25 seconds. And I probably had it at 30 seconds before, f20, 30 seconds, which would make a much brighter image. But then I looked at my histogram and it was probably touching that right side. And I'm like, okay, let me back it off, 25, to expose to the right as far as I can, but not touch that right side. And some of the cameras have something called the highlight alert, often referred to as blinkies. And I would recommend that you turn those on at all times in your camera. And when you review the image you've just taken on the back of your LCD, there will be areas in this picture, there's probably nothing because I didn't touch the right side. But if there's an overexposed area that is just pure white now, where there's no more detail, it will blink. There will be like parts of your image that just flash. And there you lost total detail, which we try to avoid. Here's a slide on long exposure. So long exposure in landscapes can be really fun and useful to explore. For example, you can catch car lights. Maybe they come down a mountain road or they go over the bridge, and just a few seconds, and you can get these beautiful streaks. Another long exposure, for example, this picture. It's up in Maine. It's the Bass Harbor Lighthouse, and that's the Atlantic Ocean. And up in Maine, with the rocky coast, it's usually quite a few waves in there. But the long exposure again makes the ocean very silky smooth. And again, 30-second exposure on a tripod, and you can see the reflection of the lighthouse in that puddle there. And that is really, really sharp. For 30 seconds, there was no camera shake, nobody bumped the tripod, there was no bad wind. You get a sharp image. Did I stress that enough today, that we need a sharp image and that we need a good tripod? Okay, high dynamic range. So early on today, I said, dynamic range, the camera is really limited what it can do, seeing the darkest darks and the brightest brights. And this was an image, November again, up in Iceland, a waterfall you can go behind. And you're like in a little overhang, you're like almost in a cave back there. And looking out, the camera said, hey, we'll take this picture and this is what it will look like. And I'm not happy with that, right? I don't see any details in the darks. And the sky just looks really bright. It's kind of like not very exciting. So, and looking at this histogram, I just showed you an example of the histogram exposing to the right. If I look at this histogram for this particular image, you can see there's a lot of, the curves are touching the left side, meaning there is a lot of darkness where I don't have much detail anymore. And on the right side is touching the right side, meaning there's a lot of detail that are lost in the sky. There's parts of that sky that's just pure white. And no matter what I do in post-processing, it will always be pure white. So what do? that would be a good example to shoot high dynamic range. Many cameras have that built in now as one of their modes. You can set it to high dynamic range. It will take 3 images, maybe 5 images. It will combine it right in camera. And then you get a beautiful image where everything seems to be perfect and right. You can do it manually. I prefer to do it manually. And for example, now, remember the image in the middle is what the camera told me I should, what the camera read and said, this is a good exposure. And I disagreed with the camera. So I took a picture that is underexposed. Look at the one on the left. All of a sudden, I see details in the sky. And then I took a picture that was overexposed. And all of a sudden, I see the details in the rock. And in Lightroom, you can combine them. You merge these 3 images in Lightroom, do a little bit of editing. And then you wind up with an image where, hey, I see all the clouds in the sky. And hey, I can see all the the details in those rocks that I was in that cave. And that's when you use an HDR. Now, I couldn't use that graduated filter really well for that scene to make the sky darker because it was not, the graduated filters, they have like a kind of like a left to right, like a linear division line between light and dark. And with the darkness being all around, I was surrounded, was like almost framed in that cave by darkness. That wasn't possible. Okay, we're getting close to the end. We'll talk about composition, we'll talk about scouting, and then we'll take some questions. So composition, I want to show you 4 basic compositions or techniques. So this is rule of thirds, and I know that all of you, no matter if you're like the earliest beginner, you probably heard of that too at one point. Rule of thirds, if you move the object that you photograph out of the middle of the frame and you put it just a little off, to the left, to the right, up, down, or maybe to the right and down like I did in this image, it oftentimes creates a photograph with more interest to the viewer. Like all of a sudden this grain silo is out of the middle and it's down there on the right side, and I'm like, wow, this is like kind of like off balanced a little bit this way, but it adds more interest. And this was in Washington State. If you're ever out in eastern Washington State, there's this beautiful farmland called the Palouse. Find some leading lines. There could be a road, it could be a river, or it could be, like in this example, a waterfall. Help your viewer to find his or her way through the image. Many times when somebody looks at an image, they look at the brightest area, or they look like at something that is big right in front of them. So in this example, if you view this image, the viewer may start on the bottom where the water pools and then go up that waterfall, and you can help guide the viewer through the image, making it a better composition this way. And again, that was up in the Canadian Rockies. If you're ever up there, Canadian Rockies rock, they're really beautiful. Foreground, middle ground, and background. So sometimes you stumble upon something that's close to you when you take the image. So I was in Arches National Park the end of April in 2021. And I've been like, I was there for like the weekend, so 2 days, 2 full days in the park maybe. And I kept looking for wildflower patch. And the last day when I was leaving the park, I found this scene in the morning where I had these beautiful wildflowers right in front of me. So I wanted to include them in the scene. Now, if you include the foreground, oops, something happened to the, hold on. I lost my mouse for a second. Hold on. I am, for some reason, stuck. Oh, I didn't want that. I'm sorry. I'm in the annotate and I have to get out of that. Clear, clear. I have to exit. No. Oh, okay. Here we go. So you want to include something in the foreground, and then maybe something in the midground, right? So you have these other sandstone structures there to help your viewer through the image, guide them through the image. And then if you have something in the distance, that makes for a stronger image overall. And that was, like I said, it was in Arches National Park outside of Moab in Utah. And then sometimes, I would advise you to try to capture a unique perspective. I went again Arches National Park a few years ago. I was there during the middle of the day. In the middle of the day, it was a blue sky, not too many clouds in the sky, a lot of tourists in there in that neighborhood, in that area. And I'm like, okay, I want to capture the double arch here, which is enormous. I want to take a picture of that. But if I just shoot it straight on, I will come home with a very boring picture. So I crawled up, I climbed the rock a little bit to get right underneath the arch. And I decided, because it's so tremendous, I decided to do a panoramic picture. So I took an HDR. I just explained HDR to you, and you can imagine that being there midday, the sky is really bright and the rocks are really dark. So I decided on HDR. And because it was so tremendous, I decided to do it with a panel. So I took a total of 15 images, which I then merged in Lightroom to come up with this. And just to tell you how big this arch is, it's 144 feet wide, the bigger arch, which divided by 3 is almost 50 meters across and almost 30 meters high. So it's a very large arch. And I couldn't capture that with my wide angle lens. It was just not wide enough to do it in one shot. Post-processing. I'm going to show you a raw image, an image that came right off my camera. And I really quickly show you what I can do in Lightroom and in Photoshop to make it a much stronger image. And I want to do that because I judge camera club competitions in New Jersey. And many times I see images like this one here out of my camera, which looks, it looks very flat in many ways. It looks like, yeah, it's a nice image, but the impact is not there. The oomph, the wow factor is not there. And we can do so many things in post-processing. And I know photographers that take great photos and they don't do post-processing at all. But it can help you to create your image in a way that you saw when you were there. You felt something that when you were there and saw that. And our camera oftentimes they cannot capture that well. That's why we do the post-processing. So in Lightroom, what you can do and what I often do is maybe sometimes I hit the auto button when I import it into my editing program, just to see what it would look like with the settings that Lightroom recommends. If I don't like it, and many times I don't like it that much, I hit undo. But then I maybe go back to the image and say, okay, you know what, this looks a little bit crooked. Maybe my tripod wasn't exactly leveled. And then I can straighten out that image. Maybe I want to adjust contrast a little bit to get those differences between the different colors a little better. And then maybe I play with vibrance and saturation. And those two things are not the same, even though the sliders are always next to one another. And they both enhance your colors, but in slightly different ways. And if you want to know the difference between vibrance and saturation, there's tons of YouTube videos explaining that out there. I would go into this image and adjust the highlights, the shadows, the white and the black point. And to explain the difference there, a highlight adjustment is if there's an area that is too bright, I can use that slider and bring that bright area down a little bit. And in this particular image, I feel like that the waterfall, when it comes over the edge there, that is really, really white. And maybe if I bring the highlights down, I can see more texture. Similarly, the shadow slider, like maybe there's some area, the foreground right side where those rocks are, where it's really, really dark. And with the shadow slider, I can move it up a little bit and bring out some of the details that I don't see right now. White and black point is a way for your program to say, okay, is there an area in my image that is like completely white, 100% white or 100% black? And you can set those, you can play with those sliders. For example, I photographed somebody, a friend of mine, who had a black leather jacket on the other day. And I used the black point setting to make sure that in my image, it would be black again, not gray, like, or not like a lighter shade of black. It would be pure black again. So you can use the white and black point that way. And then last but not least, in Lightroom and the other programs, there are brushes. And you can go into those brushes to brighten and darken certain areas. And every program probably has a function where you can just pick one particular color and work with that. So in Lightroom, it would be really easy for me to say, okay, I want the sky to be a darker shade of blue. I go to saturation or luminance, pick the blue of the sky, and play with those sliders. Now, after doing all of that, the image may look like this. So all of a sudden, I have some streaks in the waterfall that I got back by using that highlight slider down. I straightened out the image a little bit because it looked a little crooked to me. And I saturated the greens and the blues a little bit more. So it already has a little bit more impact. Looking at the image, and sometimes I do, I tell you, I do have to set these as a background on my computer, as a wallpaper. And then after like 2 days or 3 days, I find something else that bothers me that I then have to fix again. But on this image, like if I look at it, there's two things that bothered me. There's this foreground thing over here, a little evergreen sticking out, and there's a rock that's white over there in the water, and I want to get rid of them. And in Lightroom, there's something called the cloning or the healing brush, and that would be perfect for that little rock in the back there. I just go over that rock, and I click my mouse button, and that rock will disappear. Now the foreground, with the water and that evergreen, that gets a little more tricky. And Photoshop has a function called content-aware fill, where it uses the computer software's AI to figure out, to think of like, okay, how can we fix this problem that Robert highlighted here for me? And sometimes you have to work it a little bit, but it usually does a good job getting rid of these distractions. Again, this was a scene up in the Canadian Rockies. If you're ever up there, stop by the San Wapta Falls. It's about an hour or so south of Jasper National Park. So this was the before picture, and this is the after picture. And you can see how I removed the distraction there to get rid of that tree. If you need to learn Lightroom or Photoshop, it can be quite intimidating if you start out as a beginner, because there are a lot of sliders on there. There's a lot of functions that we don't really know what they do sometimes. Go on the internet, go onto YouTube. Tons of videos available there. And if you want to buy an entire course, I can recommend Matt Kloskowski. He does a really good job with Lightroom instruction. And what I like about him is when you subscribe to his email list, whenever Lightroom does an update, like a few months ago, they did an update with their brushes. He will talk about it. Like the update comes out and here's a video like a day or 2 days later telling you all about the new functionality. And then there's the Pictas Academy, and we're going to have many more webinars in the future on all different types of topics. Okay, last topic, scouting. And I told you that's the most fun part for me. I always look forward to planning a trip and then like seeing if it really happens like that in real life when I'm there to get the shot that I want. So for scouting, research what you want to see. We have all these wonderful internet tools now. We have Instagram, we have Facebook. We can see what other people photograph. We have Google Street View to see what it looks like there. So start planning early and make a list of the things that you want to experience. On Google, sometimes I combine my search terms. I use photography or photography tours, sometimes photography ebooks, because chances are where I want to go, maybe a photographer was there already and they published something. Maybe they published an ebook I can buy. I found one for Switzerland, for the Matterhorn region. So I look into what another photographer tells me, what tips and advice they can give me. Consider photographing with a local. Oftentimes, if you go to the national parks in America, for example, there's a gateway town, and in that gateway town, there's photographers that will take you out on a tour. They will show you some places so you don't have to do all this legwork where you do a lot of research on your own. And maybe there are no places where you don't see any other tourists. Maybe they can take you somewhere else. And I always tell people visit a local photo gallery in those gateway towns to see what the local guys shoot and have on display there to get inspired. So, for example, this picture down here, I took that at a place called Alstrom Point on Lake Powell, and I connected with a local photographer who then took me out to that particular point, and we shot the sunset there. And it was about an hour drive, and the last 15 minutes or so was just completely off-road over the rocks. And I would have never found that place, and my regular rental car would not have been able to go there. But no tourists there, we were all alone, which was great. I use apps when I travel, right? So we talked earlier how you want to be somewhere for sunset or sunrise. So we need to know how long it takes us. So keep in mind that Google Maps is usually pretty good in terms of travel times. But then we have to hike too. And I use all trails for hiking. And that's worldwide. There's trails there in Iceland and Germany and Switzerland. I often use all trails just to figure out what is the trail condition, because people will post reviews on there and say, okay, we went yesterday and the trail was closed, or the trail was muddy, or the trail was icy. So I get that information, and it tells me the elevation and how long the trail is. So for example, this was the trail to Delicate Arch in Arches National Park, and I know that going there and coming back would be 3.5 miles. So going there is just 1.5 miles, a little bit more than that, 600 feet elevation gain. And I'm like, okay, from what I know, it's probably like an hour, 15 minutes, 1.5 hours for me to make it there. And then you arrive where you are. You use that app to tell you when is sunrise and when is sunset, and you arrive and then you set up. Arches National Park, I got there in the late afternoon. You can tell by the long shadows that my tripod is casting already. And people are all over the arch. They go under the arch and they look up and they have a good time. If you've never been there, this thing is amazing. You need to go. And this picture was taken with my cell phone. Late afternoon, I'm setting up. But then I'm waiting for that golden hour. I wait for the sun to go down, because all of a sudden the magic happens. They don't call it golden hour for nothing. And all of a sudden, taken with my cell phone again, not edited, all of a sudden, like that red rock turns really red out there in Arizona and Utah. So yeah, be there during golden hour. Don't leave before. Wait until it's over. Wait until the sun is down, and then maybe wait another hour or so when you get all those blues and purples in the sky. And that was Delicate Arch. Again, shot at f20. We got some foreground, middle ground. We got those mountains in the background. ISO 50, low ISO on a tripod. This is almost all I have for you. I want to point out that Julia, who's on the call here, will talk in 2 weeks about Milky Way photography for beginners. So I'm excited about that, because I don't do Milky Way photography at all, and I'm happy to learn. And with that, are there any questions? I know I put a lot of information out today, and it was all very basic, and I hope that I answered some of your questions. So are there any questions? Please put it in the Q&A, or put it in the chat. That will work for me too.
Robert, we've got a couple of questions in the Q&A. And if anybody wants to ask a question, if you raise your hands, we can unmute you to talk to Robert.
Okay, I see the Sharon has 2 questions in the Q&A and says 2 were answered. Oh no, that's from somebody else. Okay, Sharon's question. Sharon Crocker, I hope I said that correctly, says, I used to hear about diffraction when using, say, f22. Is that not really an issue? I'm not really sure what it is. People say that at that end of the lens, like when you shoot at f22, if your lens goes to f22 or f20, that your image will not be as sharp anymore as when you shoot at f16 or f11 or in that range. And they tell you to stay away from that. And I don't know if that is the case with the cheaper landscape lenses, but if you have one of the higher end ones from from Canon or Nikon, that is not a big problem, if it's even a problem at all, to shoot at f22 for those lenses. But if you're worried about it and your lens goes to f22, shoot at f18. Back it off a little bit, because people talk about it, but I've never seen that. What are the good photo pills tutorials? And I believe it's Outdoor Travel Photography School or something like that. I have to Google that real quick. Her name is Brenda. And I'll look that up just in a second, and I'll type it in the chat box. Let me just bring it up on my phone to make sure I give it the right information.
Robert,
yeah.
Can I just ask you to stop sharing your screen so that everybody? Yeah. That's great. Thank you.
Oh, certainly. Is that better?
It is. Thank you.
Okay, then let me go to my browser real quick and look up that address for you. It was Outdoor Photography School, I believe. Yes. If you go to Outdoor Photography School on YouTube, there's a lot of videos there on how to use photo pills. Okay, Raymond had a question. For the adjustment on post, you didn't talk about the layers. No, I did not talk about the layers because I feel that layers goes into Photoshop a lot more. And to work with different layers, that would, I think, be beyond a beginner and intermediate course for today. I think editing in layers is like a whole course or class by itself.
Do we have any more questions? Has anybody got? Oh, I think we've got somebody with their hand. Woody, can you see?
Dave.
Yeah, hi, can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Fantastic. Listen, love the lecture. It's always a good way to, reground yourself. So I really appreciate what you guys have done here. I was really surprised, if you go back to that New York image, that at 30 seconds, you didn't get more blurriness in the sun. The sun and the rays coming off the sun seemed awfully sharp for 30 seconds. So I get the effect on the I guess that's the Hudson River there, and getting it like glass. But I'm surprised that there isn't more blurriness in the sun. And I guess just in your experience, out at 30 seconds, it seems, would you advise us to go that long when the sun is rising? Or
well, for the starburst, I don't know if I had a starburst in all 3 frames. I would have to go back to it, right? It was a 3 image HDR at the end. Okay. And I would have to go back and look into it. But with the sun behind the building, right, I was probably able to squeeze out another 30-second exposure, and probably in a following exposure that I shot much quicker, maybe the sun and the sunburst was visible. And when I combined them to make that HDR, then it probably worked out that way, to have the final image.
Yeah, I was curious about that. Thank you very much.
Yeah. I mean, if you do a 30-second exposure, right, and you look into the sun, then that sun would move, and you wouldn't get that circle and the starburst that way. Yeah.
Thank you.
That's great. Do we have any more questions from anyone? Yep, I can see there's another hand up. David, up to you.
Yes, I'm just curious if the trips that you were showing, were they all personal trips, or were you on workshops or teaching workshops?
I was not teaching, and I was not on a workshop for the most part. Some of them were family vacations. And it's all for the family vacation, it's landscape photography is not that bad, because you can like get out of being with the family in the morning for sunrise, and probably in the afternoon for the sunset or the evening, right? And spend time with the family doing fun stuff during the day when the light is not that great anyway. and take shots this way and go hiking with your family. Other times I'm lucky enough that I travel a little bit in the United States because I have work responsibilities in the Denver area and in Western Colorado a couple times a year. And I'm able to go to Colorado and Montana and Utah this way for just a weekend. And I live close to New York City, so sometimes some people on this call and I will go, to adventure in Manhattan a little bit.
Nice. Okay. And I have another question, if that's okay.
Sure.
A more general question about the collective. I missed the very first part, so I'm not sure if you explained what the collective is and what is the purpose? What are you about?
So I'll answer that one for you, David. We're a multicultural community, and it's a group of photographers, artists and creators. And we're creating a community for, to connect, to inspire each other, and also to learn and grow together. I hope that answers your question, and you can find more information on our website. I've dropped the link in onto the chat, so if you have a look at that, you can go and have a look at our memberships, etc. as well.
Thank you.
Has anyone got another question?
I think there is a question in the question and answer box from Raymond. I don't know if that one was answered.
Let me go. Raymond.
Oh, this last one. No, it's when we have multiple elements to focus. How do we go about with focusing all of them?
For that, if you have multiple elements, like the shot in Arches National Park where I had the flowers in front of me, those wildflowers, right? So where do I focus on? And if I shoot at f/22, which I often do, I know from experience that the foreground, the middle ground, and the background will be in focus for me, unless I have something that is just a few feet, like really close to me. Now, if I want to include that, then we would do something called focus stacking, maybe, where we take two images and we stack them together where everything is in focus. But that would, again, be like more of an intermediate technique to do. But what I would recommend if you're ever in doubt, right, I would recommend that you review the image that you've just taken and you zoom in on that preview on the back of your camera and make sure that everything you want to be in focus is in focus then. And then you adjust as needed.
That's great. Thanks, Robert. So I think we've answered all the questions, and I just want to say thank you. That was a really informative and very inspiring talk. It was great that you let us know that you're self-taught and you've confidently taken us through a very informative webinar. So I'd just like to say thank you on behalf of everybody from Pictas for a great webinar. And we hope that you will think about joining us. You can see the links in the chat. And good night to everybody. Thank you.
Well, thank you again for having me, and thank you everybody for coming on, and nice comments that you left in the chat.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Everyone.
Bye.